With today being all about mortgages, I want to tell you about how I got my first mortgage, how I refinanced it, and what happened when I moved. After graduating college, I decided that I wanted to move out to Utah for my first job, and I did not want to rent. I wanted to buy. The market was hot, and I was bound and determined to get myself into a mortgage, which was really challenging because I was following the Dave Ramsey plan all the way through college up to this point. And if you're familiar with Dave's plan, you know that he's super anti credit card and says that you need to simply avoid playing the credit score game entirely. And when people say, well, how do you get a mortgage, Dave? He says you got to do manual underwriting. He even has a mortgage lender that he endorses who will do manual underwriting for you. So I went to this particular mortgage lender who I'll leave unnamed here. They're not sponsoring this episode. And they told me that there was nothing that could be done. Reason being, I didn't have any established work history that was comparable to the pay that I was going to have with my first full-time job. I didn't have any rent history for showing that I was good at paying my bills. I didn't have any utility bill payment history because I lived with my parents through school. I was literally moving out from home trying to get a mortgage. And without a credit score, I could not jump into this mortgage with manual underwriting. I've heard Dave Ramsey address this once on his show where he had another young gentleman call in and say, I'm trying to do the manual underwriting thing, but I've never rented before. And he says, you found the one situation where my advice does not match up, and you're going to simply have to rent for a little bit in order to build up the history and build up the work history for manual underwriting to be able to take place. And this was my very first time truly deviating from Dave Ramsey's teachings, as I wasn't willing to wait. I was stubborn. So I went out and I got my first 1, 2, then 3 credit cards. And I also signed up for some consulting with a credit score expert. Within a matter of a couple months, I was able to establish a credit score that was enough for me to get into a mortgage. Not a very good mortgage, but I did open the door to home ownership, which is what I truly wanted. On a recent episode, I talked about how I graduated debt-free and that I had some cash in my reserves at graduation. And I spent almost all of it. I spent it on a diamond ring. I replaced my vehicle with an SUV. And I put a down payment on this new mortgage of mine. The house hunting adventure is a story all to itself, but when it came to the mortgage, I had a little bit more than the bare minimum down payment that was required. If I remember right, I only had 4% for my down payment. What I was buying was a $175,000 condo in Utah. Now, this was an interesting circumstance. I, at the time, didn't realize you could do this. I had closing costs associated with getting this mortgage that I didn't work into my plan when I was calculating my down payment. For this reason, when my agent reached out and discussed closing costs with me, I didn't have the capital to cover them. And he told me that I had the option of providing the capital for those closing costs, or I could simply roll that expense into the interest rate. I didn't have an option, and I quite confidently said, let's just roll it into the rate. I really wanted to get into home ownership. Now, you should know, interest rates were floating around 4.5% on average for those who were buying in Utah. And because I didn't have a lot of credit history backing me, and I rolled all my closing costs into the rate, I had over 5.5% as my interest rate on this mortgage. More than a full percent above the average. But it didn't matter to me. I was going to get into this home. I wanted to start building equity. Now, Dave Ramsey, and quite frankly, I would tell you that going too whole hog on this when you have almost nothing is very risky. One thing that helped me cut back on risk is I bought a condo as opposed to a home, which meant I was only responsible for maintaining the interior of the condo while the exterior was all the responsibility of the HOA, which was expensive, but still. Now, one other thing before we move on to the refinancing, I got myself a 20-year mortgage on this condo. Even though I'd broken away from Dave Ramsey's plan, I was still trying to fit the 15-year mortgage in, but it was not going to be accommodating for the percentage of my gross pay. I simply could not afford a 15-year mortgage. And a 30-year mortgage was going to result in, I think, about 20% of my payment going towards principal and 80% going to interest for my first payments, give or take. A 20-year mortgage, on the other hand, was going to be able to get what went to principal early on over 30%. We'll talk more about this later in the main topic. I felt like a 20-year mortgage was a really good compromise for me, and if I'm buying in my early 20s, I'm definitely not going to be getting the end of my mortgage close to when I'm retiring. I was also not planning to remain in this condo for the entirety of my working career through to retirement, so I wasn't as concerned when it comes to complying with what I now call hope-filled footstep number 7. All right, I did it. I got my first mortgage right out of school, and I had an above average interest rate, but I purchased before the plague. I purchased before COVID. I had this condo for 2, 3 years before interest rates really plummeted to their record lows. And like many of the homeowners listening, I wanted to refinance in order to get that low 2.5% interest rate. I had enough history now that I could go with manual underwriting to get this rate, or I had a credit score because I'd been paying off a mortgage. My credit score was decent enough that I could refinance and get a 2.5% interest rate on another 20-year mortgage. This reduced interest rate really cut my monthly payment down substantially. And while there were closing costs associated with the refinancing, my break even with how much money I was saving on interest alone was only 2 months, making refinancing a no-brainer. So I refinanced the mortgage and continued to live in the condo up until we were ready to move here to Kansas City. Now, I've only lived in this condo for 4 years, but the appreciation was significant, enough so that I have easily recouped my closing costs from the initial purchase and the refinancing through my newfound equity. I was originally planning on staying in Utah for 5 years or so that the closing costs could indeed definitively very likely be recouped by the appreciation, but the market as it blew up accelerated that timeline and gave me more degrees of freedom to move sooner. I took all the equity from my condo and some savings to put a 60% down payment on my next home. And in moving to a lower cost of living area, I was able to double the square footage of my dwelling while maintaining around the same cost for my mortgage. Truly, I think keeping equity as equity when I relocated was a very wise move. And it kept me on track for getting rid of my mortgage well ahead of retirement, as when I moved, I targeted another 20-year mortgage. I technically have around 18 years left on this mortgage, which puts me well ahead of finishing my mortgage before retirement, even if I don't pay anything extra. My new mortgage had a 4.5% interest rate and a slightly higher starting balance than my first mortgage. And this time, I didn't feel trapped in rolling all of my closing costs into the rate. I was able to apply my equity toward those and simply decrease my substantial down payment on the home. Now, one thing I'm happy to report is my mortgage payment is about 50% interest, about 50% principal at this time, and I think that's pretty good. And that covers my personal story with mortgages so far. If this inspired you in any way or you learned something new through this story, please let me know about it in the comments below. Now it's time to roll into today's main topic.